Happy Valentine's Day, a day early, everybody, and welcome to Ellensburg, Washington, USA. The local time is 11:46 a.m. Pacific Time, and today's date, Thursday, February 13th of 2025. Where the weather continues to be bitter cold here. I know, it's colder where you are, but 24 degrees Fahrenheit, very raw out there, overcast, changes are coming weather-wise, but it has been blah here for, feels like a couple of weeks. So everybody's ready for a change of weather, a change of scenery. We've got a 3-day weekend coming up, so very good. I see that it's 5 by 5. Thank you for that report. Where are you viewing from today? Can I say hi to a number of you? And I have 2 thank yous to share with you all before I take my walk out in the hallway and then eventually outside. It's the middle of a school day. Everybody's kind of sleepwalking around, but I have energy. I have energy for us. I'm excited about today's episode. I hope you enjoy it. Ben is in the Netherlands, Newland, North Carolina. Jim is in Chico, California. Kirk is in Sweden. Kirk and Valentina, to be precise. Wes is in Chelmsford, England. Yeah, it makes sense. Overseas folks, it's the end of a workday for you all, so it's evening time for you. Thomas is Hurricane, Utah. Bitterroot Valley, Montana. Marysville, Washington. Saber is in Baja, Mexico. Vicky's in Marysville, Washington. Kent is in the Luss of Louisiana. Don, it says it's minus 5 degrees Fahrenheit in Fairbanks, Alaska. Yes, we have nothing to complain about here, Don, for sure. Very little snow. Hopefully some snow coming in the mountains, but there you go. Kirk is in Philomath, Oregon. Hello, Kirk. Arnhem, the Netherlands. That's Tom Van Arld. Lake Oswego, that's Larry. Portland, Oregon. Snowy Milwaukee, Oregon, that's Doug. It's snowy in Oregon, okay. Snowy in Portland, okay, that's interesting. Adventuresome Brada in Waikele, Hawaii. Hello, Brada. Rogers in Selah, Washington. Nina is in rainy San Diego. Yeah, we're all experiencing some kind of weather, but man, I'm ready for spring. How about you? I am just ready. I'm ready. But we need to be patient. Over the Moon is in Windham, Minnesota. Moscow, Idaho, that's Sheila Schneider. Gabriella is in France. That's French. Hello, Gabriella. Hillsboro, Oregon. Garrett, the Dutch Night Owl from the Netherlands. Hello, Garrett. Phil's at the Index Pluton. Brandon says it's snowing like crazy here. Okay. Nashville, Eddie. Centralia, Washington. Hello from Norway. Josephine. Hello, Joe. You're in Hogue Hall. Is that did I meet you the other day? Joe? Must be. It was nice to meet you. Two buildings away. Gail's in Tonasket, Washington. Okay, so, and so on. Thank you. So, 2 quick thank yous before we begin today. I watched the replay of the last show. I always wait until the live chat is available. It usually takes half a day or whatever. Sometimes it's right away. That's weird, but it took about half a day since the Saturday morning show, and I finally watched it. And I saw in the live chat, I mentioned very quickly that last episode was the last of the red shirts. The last of the red shirt shows. And I just said, I think under my breath, like, well, I don't have a brown shirt. And a bunch of you in the live chat said, you're probably going to get a brown shirt sent to you. And as a matter of fact, I did. Thank you, Don in Erie, Pennsylvania, who immediately after Saturday's show, maybe during Saturday's show, Don, you went to LL Bean's website or you called them or whatever, and this arrived in the mail yesterday here in Ellensburg. And Don, it is rare for my wife Liz to comment on my wardrobe because it's the same wardrobe I've worn for years. And I have shirts and pants that I just wear until they literally have holes in them and they're all frayed and I finally get rid of them. But she commented 2 different times, this morning and yesterday, "Whoa, that's a nice shirt." Kind of like, "You don't buy nice new things. What's wrong with you?" And I said, "It's Don in Erie, Pennsylvania. That's who bought it." She's like, "Oh, makes sense. Nice shirt." So Don, thank you for impressing my wife and for your generosity, of course. Brown show today, brown show on Saturday. I'll be wearing this both times, at least. Thank you, Don. Also, not to be outdone, Rick in Silver City, New Mexico. Howdy, Nick. Nice things, nice things. I have had this bolo in mind since I saw you wear a bolo during one of your Cascade episodes. The backing is Cordia bocote, which grows in Mexico and Central America. It can represent the region Mount Stewart may have come from. The white wood surrounding the coulee is ginkgo wood. The only place I was able to locate any ginkgo is that I could buy from an outfit in Japan that was selling ginkgo cutting boards, and that, in addition to petrified Forest State Park, it can also represent the loess. The black material forming the coulee is, of course, basalt. I found basalt fibers that are used to reinforce concrete and have enclosed a small bag of them for grins. I used CA glue, kind of a super glue, to bond the many fibers into a series of columns. Yes, one at a time. And then with the glue, I added dark sand as a talus slope, but added too much and had to remove it with a carbide burr bit on a router. This effectively wore the burrs down to a smooth cylinder. And then I just added a small amount of brown glue as a talus slope. The routing made a smoother face for the columns than I visualized, but there is variation. Hey, this is at once the prototype and the only finished coulee bolo tie I have in mind making. The hammers were from an Etsy store. Okay. So, Rick in Silver City, New Mexico, would you like to see what Rick, I guess you already saw it, kind of. But this is a work of art. Thank you, Rick, for a custom-made bolo tie that tangibly and physically represents much of the geology of Washington State. One at a time. Columns in a horseshoe-shaped cliff. Ice Age floods. Ice Age floods coming this way, carving out to make dry falls, drumheller channels, and so on. And some of this wood, whether it was the ginkgo wood or something else, was from a scrap from a guitar maker that Rick knows. And then here, dangling the bolo. This is Rick O'Ryan, worksongs.net. He's a woodworker, maybe an amateur, maybe a professional. Bocote, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, ginkgo, basalt, pewter. And here are the little basalt fibers. Thank you, Rick, so much for your gift. Well, I am tricked out today. Faux show. It's like, what's with the big guy with the crucifixes walking around campus? Well, born-again geologist. Here's to you, Rick. And here's to you, Don. Thank you, both. Thanks, everybody. Looks like we're functional. I've got an excellent connection. Nat the Wonder Boy has been in here helping, and we solved a few problems, so I think we're good. And out the window you go. I'll take a walk, and we will begin the program today in about 5 minutes or so. Thank you. Hot mic. Okay. It's a community. You have more things that you're sharing from the community. Don't rush through that. This is a special community that exists. Everybody feels good when they know they're in a community. Okay. Are you starting with the story? How are you going to hook? Is it a couple of slides and then you go to Sharpie? How are you going to set the hook? Is it verbal? Oh, boy. I don't remember. Look at the slides. Yeah, maybe the slides do the... Come on now, focus. Maybe the slides do the hook, and then you do verbal hook with Sharpie Marker Theater. That's it. The slides do the hook. It's a combination of you and the slides setting the hook. It's got to be you and the slides. Mostly you. Come on. It can't be the slides. It's got to be you. Come on. I just decided. It's you. It's you. It's always been you. A brown shirt. A bolo tie. I got 4 minutes to figure it out. Hot mic. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's episode. So glad that you're with us. We're talking about something called the Yakima Basalts this afternoon, also known as the Columbia River Basalts, also known as the Flood Basalts, also known as the German chocolate cake. So that's our first objective. Can we work with all four of those phrases interchangeably? They all mean the same thing. Yakima Basalts, Columbia River Basalts, German chocolate cake, Flood Basalts. Okay? So most of you are familiar with those lavas. They're out in eastern Washington. They erupted over by Idaho 16 million years ago. The Flood Basalts did. And here on Third Person Thursday, Nick Zentner wants to talk about the Flood Basalts this winter in this alphabet, V, for Valentine's Day, a day early. Why? These lavas didn't erupt in the Cascades. You're right, they did not. But 16 million years ago, as you can see over my shoulder, there was so much magma, so much mafic magma, so much Hawaiian or Icelandic-like orange lava coming out of cracks over by Idaho, mostly flowing west towards the Cascades. And the question that you can see on the board is, did those flood basalts 16 million years ago cross the Cascades? And at first glance, it sounds like a crazy question. And at second glance, it sounds like a crazy question. Probably third and fourth time too. You're like, I know they're big lava flows, but they're not that big. And wasn't there a Columbia River Gorge, which was a pathway through the Cascades anyway? So I don't understand what the question is even asking. The question is literally saying, was there a wall of basalt, maple syrup, flowing over all of the Cascade Mountains in Washington 16 million years ago? And it's an old idea, more than 50 years old, that some people were teaching in classrooms at the University of Washington, for instance, Bates McKee, J. Hoover Mackin. Others were writing on, research-wise, before 1970, let's say. And so I have a soft spot in my heart for narratives in geology involving Washington geology that used to be all the rage, and then nobody's talking about it anymore. Does that sound familiar? Last winter, what did we do? We talked about the Spokane flood of J. Harlan Brett's. Paper after paper after paper in the 1920s. Brett's had one big flood of water out in eastern Washington involving these flood basalts, by the way. But in the last 50 years, nobody's been talking about the Spokane flood. Everybody's talking about the Missoula floods instead. They got done talking about the blue flood. They were only talking about the red floods. Well, I'm kind of at it again this winter, surprisingly. I'm wondering if it's worth thinking about this question again, because nobody's entertaining the question currently. I'm trying to set the hook verbally. And I've got a lot. I've got a lot for you. I've had a lot of fun in the last 5 days asking this question to pretty much whomever I can find. Emails back and forth with geologists. I'll share some of them. Zoom interviews. I did 3 of them. They're in the video library. We'll look at some clips. I've done some reading, old stuff and new stuff. I've been sent diagrams, old diagrams, new diagrams. And last thing I want to do before we go to some visuals, I don't want to frame this as I'm trying to convince you that the answer is yes. I'm not insisting on this narrative. Because to be totally honest, it's been fun to find some new information on this old question. But we're mostly talking about basalts that were eroded as the Cascades uplifted. So there's like negative evidence to answer this question. But it's still a significant possibility, and that's what we're trying to lean into here today. So let's enjoy the journey. I'm talking to myself, but maybe I'm talking to you as well. Journey, I hate that. Let's enjoy this collection of ideas. And this is going to be one of those shows that's going to spill into Saturday, I'm almost sure. I've got way too much for one show. This is also going to be one of those shows where you need to be patient. Hey, super bright people who are always ahead of everybody else, congratulations, number one, on the size of your brain. And then those big-brained people, this one's going to bug you because I'm going to keep coming back. We're just going to keep working on these themes. And it's intentional because there's enough here that I want all of us to kind of grasp it. And as we repeat in different forms, the variety platter will be here again. Video clips, maps, email excerpts, Zoom interviews, being out in the field, being here in the office. That's all intentional. But I love this set of questions and ideas, and I'm still very excited about it. And I hope you will too. So let's go to the website and show you how out of control I am. Here we are. This is not out of control. We know how to find these episodes, and here we are. This one's going on right now. Yes, very good. And if we go back to the homepage, if we go to the Cascade Video Library, I talked to Andrew Sadowski about this topic yesterday, or 2 days ago, I guess. I talked to Sky Cooley. I talked to Lydia Steich. We'll look at clips of all three of these guys. The Goat Rock Zircon video, that will wait until a few days from now. And if we go, this is Third Person Thursday. Nick Zentner is officially out of control. I'm not even going to count. There's easily 15 or more separate papers for episode V. And maybe some of these will get shifted up to W as I kind of reshuffle the deck. But there is a lot here and plenty we will not comment on today or maybe even Saturday. But there's all sorts of new and old stuff waiting for if you're interested. One more thing. I'm pretty sure let's look at Docky. I'm pretty sure for the rest of the alphabet, I've made a couple of executive decisions. So we know the schedule. Get rid of that. I've decided, pretty sure I'm going to stick with this, that today and Saturday are brown, because I have my beautiful brown shirt. And then we're going to jump right to purple and the Goat Rocks. And so I think there's after this weekend, I think there's 3 shows left that are all purple, mostly purple, and the three last letters of the alphabet will be tied to the Goat Rocks volcano scene, the volcanic complex, and thinking about calderas. And I think we'll spend some time looking at different ages of calderas. So we might find some purple calderas, some yellow calderas, some brown calderas, some red calderas for sure. We did that with Paul Hammond last time. Maybe even a couple of green calderas. You know the color scheme. But in addition to the caldera narrative, meeting Kelly Wall by Zoom, meeting Hannah Shamloo again, but this time just one-on-one with her via Zoom, will be a nice way to kind of wrap things up. And then I have a special surprise in episode Z that will help us look back also as to where we've been the whole series. Okay. Let's go to the slides and see what I have. I don't remember. So this one's loose. Usually it's loose because it's Saturday morning and I haven't had much time to prepare and I just kind of wing it. Today is loose because I have so much. I don't know how I want to kind of operate. But you have the slides be a guide for us here. Thank you so much for being with us. I'll make one more comment. I'm extra verbal here at the beginning. I've done these alphabets many winters in a row now. I still love doing them. I do notice that the overall view numbers for the letters decrease as the alphabet goes on. And we're not getting up to 10,000 views anymore for each of these. You can say, well, it's gloomy weather and people just are like depressed and don't want to watch. Or the shows started sucking and so they stopped watching. Or they just feel like they got behind and they can't get caught up again. So I say that especially because special thanks to you for getting caught up or staying up to date with what's going on. It's meaningful. I know there's a lot of other options, even in wintertime, for you to be doing other things. But many of you have stuck with this and you've made it to episode V, and I'm very appreciative. It's fun to have you here. Thank you. Okay, well, let's see where we go. Did I set the hook? I tried. Nick Zentner tried on Thursday. Let's explore. We go here first. 1947, this old pamphlet, J. Hoover Mackin and Alan Carey. This has been around the department. This has been in my files for 35 years. I've never really used it, and I have a use for it today. Shall we read what J. Hoover Mackin wrote right after the Second World War about this topic today? When the outpourings of flood basalt finally ceased, the lava surface extended as an almost featureless plain, covering much of Washington and Oregon, and extending entirely across the site of today's Cascades to the ocean. Some of the older volcanic peaks along the Cascade axis in Oregon may have stood like islands above a basalt flood, and new volcanoes were doubtless growing on its surface along this north-south belt in increasing crustal unrest. In Washington, the shoreline of the lava sea lapped across the subdued stumps of the Calkins Mountains. Those are just the mountains, the low hills that were red time, basically, and earlier. And a somewhat rougher landscape on granitic rocks farther north, in the North Cascades, in other words, Gary Paul country. In this frame of our motion picture, the topography of western Oregon and western Washington certainly differed markedly from what it is now. But the major outlines of the present drainage were rather fully developed, and the distribution of all the principal rock types, except for the modern Cascade volcanoes, was much the same as today. The stage was set for the birth of the Cascades. J. Hoover Mackin, 1947. And you're like, isn't that cute? Those guys didn't know anything back in 1947. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have all this amazing stuff we have today. Those poor bastards back there, they were barely struggling along. Those folks did a lot of field work. And generally, we don't do that much field work anymore. And so I'm listening always to these old timers. And yes, it's just like last winter. What did I say? I'm willing to listen to J. Harlan Brentz. He was out in the field 10 times, 100 times more than anybody I'm listening to in modern day about the Ice Age floods. Maybe the same is true here. These old school field relations. We saw Paul Hammond do it a whole career. Don Swanson do it a whole career. Many of these old-timers need to be listened to, and that's what we're doing here today, among other things. So, Ellensburg, Washington exists here. Here are the Yakima Basalts, and I'm choosing Yakima Basalt because that's the way Don Swanson and Paul Hammond were typically talking about these flood basalts in their maps west of Yakima, Washington. Here we go. Backcountry Gary Paul, yet again. I met Gary for the first time at a pop-up geology session up on Lion Rock, north of Ellensburg. And I think this is probably the same day that Gary was wandering before or after our little impromptu geology talk, and he took this stunning photograph. This is the crystalline core of the North Cascades, including Mount Stewart, the centerpiece of Baja, BC. And here's 2,000 vertical feet of German chocolate cake that just ends. Why does it just end? How much more west did those Yakima basalts flow into the Cascades 16 million years ago? This is maybe the only Gary Paul photo today, but it's a winner. Thank you, Gary Paul. Okay. Sharpie marker theater. Let's try this. I feel like I need to set the hook again, but withdrawing. And I'm going to do it quickly because this is kind of a composite. I had this idea this morning. I think it's going to work. I haven't rehearsed it. I've been giving talks on the old Columbia River. I've been talking about the flood basalts. I've been talking about a lot of concepts that are pertaining to today's topic. So I need to do it very quickly with Sharpie marking pens to help you see exactly what I'm trying to ask here today. You're like, I get it. I don't need this. There's nuances to this. It's one simple, elegant question, but there's a lot of flavors that come out the more you kind of marinate. Whoa, listen to me. Let's do it. Once upon a time, there was a blue river called the Columbia River. And that Columbia River, once upon a time, before the German chocolate cake, before the lava flows, many geologists assume that this was the trend of the Columbia River. And it came from British Columbia, and it crossed the border into the state of Washington, and it had a relatively linear shot heading towards what is now Wallula Gap. And then whether it came truly to the Astoria area or came this way, it doesn't really matter. The point is, in eastern Washington, this was the original trend of the Columbia River, looking at the drainages that exist on both sides that survived the Yakima Basalts. And then the Yakima Basalts happened, spoiler alert, they're going to come out of fissures damn near Idaho. So this is Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, those of you watching far, far away. And 16 is the number today. 16 million years ago, we have eruption after eruption of basaltic lava, the flood basalts that are going to bury everything in up to 3 miles thick of basalt lava. I guess I should have made it brown. But the point is, our Columbia River, which used to flow like this, now is diverted. It's diverted. It's pushed off of its former course, and now it's over here. Can you see it? These lavas not only buried the landscape, but there was enough lava to cause the Columbia River to get diverted to the gutter, to the edge. And today, that's Bridgeport, Washington, that's Chelan, Washington, that is Wenatchee, Washington. The Columbia River, even today, is at the boundary between all this brown Yakima basalt and all this gray, what? Basement, right? Crystalline core. But south of Wenatchee, the Columbia River, which doesn't look blue suddenly, the Columbia River kind of swings back towards Tri-Cities and then comes out. Let me find a lighter shade of blue. Is it going to help? Probably not. So I'm going to do it again. So this big bend of the Columbia River is because of the German chocolate cake, but the edge, as we'll see today, the edge of the basalts, the margin of the Yakima basalts agrees with the Columbia, but then the Columbia decides, screw this, I'm heading onto the German chocolate cake instead of just riding this edge. Now the edge is right through Hammond Land. The edge is right through places in the Cascades today. What I'm ultimately asking today is, do you remember our big boundary between the North Cascades and the South Cascades of Washington? This is going back to the first few letters, remember? In early November. Trying to emphasize we can see the basement in northern Cascades, north of Snoqualmie Pass, and then in the southern Cascades of Washington, mostly we lose the basement, and we have these younger, meaning green, red, now brown, volcanic rocks covering the basement. So that was a significant boundary for us, that I-90 corridor. Well, now I'm wondering today if the flood basalts, once upon a time, truly did get to the ocean south of Snoqualmie Pass. And we'll look at evidence of the thickness of the basalts on both sides of the Cascades. Let's keep going. You're like, I'm more confused than I was before. Maybe I'm less confused. Maybe I'm more tantalized now. I don't know where you are. We just keep visiting these main themes, but I think it's going to work if we keep the slideshow going. Before we get to the meat of today's program, I have a couple leftover scraps from previous shows. Red Time, last show, you remember the Paul Hammond show. I was happy with it. It was a scramble, but I was happy with it. And I think Paul's family has been happy with it, and his colleagues have been happy with it. I've heard from a lot of family members and former students of Paul Hammond in the last few days. Thank you for everybody chiming in. Yes, Paul Hammond, the last episode, the most recent episode of the series. And here's Paul Hammond doing all this red stuff, doing the green stuff below. And here are our Yakima Basalts, and you'll notice he only brings them halfway into the Cascades before he has them wimp out. But he doesn't have them pinch out. Paul Hammond doesn't. Paul Hammond has these Grand Ronde basalts abruptly stop. And we're going to keep coming back to that thought today. Charlie Hammond, the son of Paul Hammond, who just passed away last month. If you're confused, you need to watch the most recent episode. Charlie insisted on providing his email for those that wanted to contact him. I'll show it to you again. But if you had a connection with Paul Hammond as a colleague, as a former student, as a family friend, maybe even as a stranger, maybe you don't have any connection to Paul Hammond, but I don't know. Charlie will have to decide. But if you are interested in attending a celebration of life of deceased geologist Paul Hammond, Portland State University, email Charlie and sometime this spring or right now, I guess, and he will give you some details on when this is happening. Loosely, it's planned for late May or early June of 2025. Of course, if you're watching this replay in 2026, this doesn't apply. But I warned you, Charlie, you're going to get a lot of emails. I hope you can handle it. Thank you for making yourself available to all that remember Paul so fondly. Paul Hammond Land, we're heading to Rainier, we're heading to Goat Rocks at the end of the alphabet, but not today specifically. Also, if we go back even earlier in the alphabet, here's another scrap that I need to include. Do you remember Jeff Tepper, the mayor of Tepperland, and the Tepper Trilogy, and the Breakoff Belt Magmas? This is blue time. This is going back 51 to 46 million years ago. You remember. It's been a long time since we've thought about that. And the Breakoff Belt Magmas, and how the spidergrams look different for this versus arc magmas, and so on. Paul in Kashmir. Viewer, Paul in Kashmir. Thank you for I don't know how many hours of your personal investment into this animation. Paul's been emailing back and forth with Jeff Tepper to put this animation together. And Paul, I will for sure, with your permission, use your animation, not only today, I'm going to show it right now, but also include it in one of the 3 downtown lectures this April, early April, as yet another tangible piece of evidence that we have a community here. So Paul even has sound on this animation. Let's do it. That's the first break of the Farallon plate. You hear that thunder? That's in Paul's animation. The rollback begins of the plate. Second break. Those are the Teanaway bimodals. That's the bimodal of Summit Creek. We continue to roll that plate down to explain our age progression, 52 to 46 or 45 million years ago in central Washington. And the animation ends there. And in the most recent 45 million years, Washington and Idaho have drifted over this picture. And so, yes, this is the Idaho slab curtain that's now currently beneath Idaho, not because this thing drifted over here. It's because Idaho drifted over the top of this slab. Thank you, Paul from Kashmir. Let's continue. I say, let's continue. Pick up the pace. We don't have much in the way of elevation during Ohanapakash time. We don't have much in the way of elevation in Fife's Peak time. You're like, I don't know. I think there's more. I think there's hills now. It's not totally sea level scene like Ohanapakash. Okay, I agree. To a point, I agree. But they're still frickin' low. And now we are to 16 million years ago, brown time. Now we're to brown time, everybody, and we still have low Cascades. So back in November, I had no idea I'd be asking this question about the Yakima Basalts crossing the Cascades. But organically, you and I, putting these letters together, going letter by letter by letter by letter, it's the last 3 weeks, I'm like, God, we are still low. When are we going to jack this mountain range up and make an actual proper mountain range called the Cascade Range? We don't have a big high mountain range to form to basically have a rain shadow and have the Cascades 20 million years ago? No, nobody says it. How about 16 million years ago? No. So this is one of those things. Remember I was talking about timing last time and soulmates, whatever. I want to do it again right now. Personally, maybe you can relate. Personally, when I'm out on a field trip, I'm taking a bunch of detailed notes, learning from Paul Hammond or Bob Bentley or some of these, usually the old timers who have all this information. And I'm trying to keep up. And I'll ask a question occasionally. How does that tie to what we saw at 10 o'clock this morning back by where we had that bush or whatever? And occasionally in my notes, I'll write, in this case, Cascades are low. And I'll just start to think about it, and then something will happen. Like somebody will say, come over here, we got a good outcrop. Or I'll be distracted by something else. Or I'll be annoyed that somebody's asking some stupid question. They're like, whatever. So I just have these little, personally, I have these little thoughts like, low Cascades is interesting. But then I just kind of move on. And the field trip doesn't stop and really absorb that concept. And so it's the timing thing again. I've always known that there's low Cascades during the time of the Yakima Basalts, but I never really thought about it that carefully. And so we're slowing down and really thinking about it carefully today. And I have for the last week plus. It's fun. I hope that you can see that. So yes, now I'm not going to gloss over it. I'm going to lean into it. This is a Paul Hammond map. And here's his ghost volcano known as Edgar Rock Volcano that probably had elevations of more than 10,000 feet elevation. Here's Don Swanson's Tieton Volcano with the radio dike swarm, remember? And here are the Yakima Basalts coming in 16 million years ago. And in the video clip we saw last time with Don Swanson, he's wondering, I wonder if these two volcanoes were totally buried in Yakima basalt, and the total burial of these two volcanoes helped them survive erosion. And I liked that idea then, but now when I actually put a couple figures on this, and these are my circles and my dates, 10 million years is a long time, so I wonder about that. But the only point of this diagram is to say, here's why, if you're still wondering why we're talking about Yakima basalts, here's one example of how we are truly getting Yakima basalts into what is known as the Cascades, and it is worth thinking about for a number of reasons. Okay, so it's official. I remember I had pink last time. I don't like it. I'm back to yellow. So, okay. So I hereby declare that I'm not going to talk about the Ellensburg Formation this winter. I don't have enough letters left. Jordan, it's okay. I'm going to save the Ellensburg Formation until this spring with Geology 351. That wasn't the original plan, but the weather's going to be crappy up in the high Cascades anyway for the 351 kids, and so I think it makes sense for us to be visiting a bunch of Ellensburg Formation outcrops this spring in April and May and early June. So I am bumping yellow Ellensburg sediments to this spring. And that allows us to spend 2 full letters on brown and then we jump right to uplift, goat rocks, and calderas for the remaining time. And that yellow is what I used 10 years ago with the interbedded Yakima basalts and these sedimentary horizons, collectively called the Ellensburg Formation. So we might talk a little bit about them on Saturday, but it won't be a full episode on the Ellensburg Formation, is my point. I'll save that for this spring. Okay, let's do some basics. And you're like, I don't need basics. I don't need basics. I watch all of your stuff, Ned Zinger. And you've talked about the Columbia River basalt lavas for all the videos you've done for the last 10 plus years. You're right. But I want to talk to everybody. And again, I think that if we keep going back to some of these basics with this new question in mind, which is an old question, I think you'll start to get more and more electrified by this question. That's my hope. Yep, Ellensburg's on the margin of a vast swamp of molten material, 16 million years old. Tom Foster, long ago, made this map, this basaltic swamp, imposed on a road map of Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Oregon. It's a vast area that was totally buried in this Yakima basalt. Oregon Public Broadcasting long ago, do I have permission to share it? No, doing it anyway. I like this old school cartoon. God knows when they made it, but I like it. It turns out that the lavas came out of cracks, and the cracks are over by Idaho. The cracks are not in the Cascades. These are called fissures, and the fissures opened up technically starting 17 million years ago, but we're focusing on the big boys, the really thick lavas that came out of the cracks 16 million years ago casually. Here's a purposeful, old, grainy, black and white photo of one of the feeder dikes. There's a reason I'm showing you this photo. Stay tuned. So each of these little black line segments are a fissure. They're a crack. So there's some of them down in southeastern Oregon, northeastern Oregon. Some of them are even up in central Washington. And in cartoonish level, some of these lavas are making it to the ocean. So you're like, I don't know, why is this a lost question? More coming on that. Here's what some of these dikes looks like. The cracks were filled with lava. It's weird inverted stuff. What was an open crack is now a ridge. And it's fun if you go down to Grand Ronde country, the Grand Ronde River, and there's all sorts of fly fishing and other things down there. You can find some of these perfectly vertical walls of basalt. And these are the feeder dikes that fed the Yakima basalts. Are we in the Cascades? No, we're not. We're down here. And please notice that these Columbia River basalt lava maps, these flood basalt maps, this map of the German chocolate cake narrows as it tries to get through the Cascade Range. But when I had these maps made a long time ago, Jennifer in Ellensburg made them. I'm like, Jennifer, and she's like, why is it narrowed down? I'm like, oh, the Cascades were there. And I just again, it's timing. I knew the Cascades were low, but I still thought they were pretty substantial and that there was no chance that these orange lavas would do a cross-country route. But that's actually what we're asking today. Actually, that's what we're asking today. All sorts of beautiful images from long ago that I've used forever in my teaching career. Yellow, Seattle, Portland, Tri-Cities, John Stockton's house in Spokane, Yakima, Ellensburg. You can see rimples or wrinkles. These are the Yakima folds. But what I really want you to notice is all this rugged landscape has been totally buried in this runny lava. All of that former rugged landscape totally buried in German chocolate cake, Yakima basalt. And here are the feeder dikes feeding these lavas. In some places, you can see many of the 300 layers exposed. This is the Grand Ronde River Canyon. Steve Rydell and many other field geologists back in the 1970s, all of them trained at Washington State University and learned and taught and researched the details in this stack of big, black, boring rocks. And they're everywhere. Yes, I'm talking about the channeled scablands. Yeah, I'm talking about Dry Falls, Grand Coulee. I'm talking about all these places, Steamboat Rock, all these places. Yes, they are the lavas we're talking about today. But the lavas are coming stratigraphically younger than many of the stories we've been exploring together this winter, and they're older than a few things we're going to try to do before we quit. But much of this up here is coming in Geology 351, which will also be live streamed twice a week, coming to a theater near you in April of 2025. Back down to ground zero, though, the Grand Ronde River Canyon. Okay, we've got the setup now, right? And so when you see a scene like this, a beautiful photo from Tom Foster in the Dalles area of Oregon, so we're in Washington looking south to Oregon, it's confusing because you see a beautiful stratovolcano, Mount Hood in the Cascades, and then you're told that this train is winding its way through a bunch of lavas. I think most everybody assumes these lavas came from that volcano. Tain't so. 2-minute guy, let's go.
2-minute geology, 2-minute geology.
Hello, young people. The Columbia River Basalts near Quincy, Washington. We're at Quincy, Washington, but we could pick any spot between Spokane, Washington, and Seaside, Oregon to do this show. These brown layers of basalt are everywhere in the place where the Ice Age floods did massive amounts of erosion thousands of years ago. There's more than 300 layers of basalt here, 300 separate volcanic eruptions. And the stack of basalt is more than 2 miles thick in places. The lavas started erupting 17 million years ago here and flooded a landscape, buried a landscape in lava. The obvious question is, which volcano erupted? Was it Mount Rainier? Mount St. Helens? The answer is none of those. The Cascade volcanoes do not match the chemistry of these basalt lavas. These are lavas that came from the east. They erupted out of fissures, deep cracks, that emitted Hawaiian-like lava starting 17 million years ago. Fissures that formed related to the birth of a hotspot that's now underneath Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. The present is the key to the past. To really visualize eastern Washington 17 million years ago, we need to go to Hawaii today. Those Hawaiian lavas today are the same kinds of lavas that we have here. Lava flows in Hawaii, very fluid. The most fluid lavas we have in nature average less than 3 feet thick. Here in eastern Washington, the lava flows average 100 feet thick. In Hawaii, the lavas travel on average 3 miles in length. Here in eastern Washington, many of the lava flows traveled 300 miles. And in Hawaii, 30 miles are covered by a typical flow. Here in eastern Washington, 30,000 square miles of area buried. The Columbia River Basalts near Quincy, Washington.
It's all out here to see. Coulees, rocks, and canyons is scenery. Right here for you and me. 2-minute geology.
Yeah, that was more than 10 years ago, and this is the hammer that was dropped in that crack and then was retrieved many years later and returned to its rightful owner. Good. If you're getting impatient, we're slowly building our way towards the crossing question. There's a bunch of advanced geology coming, but we're still in the basic portion of the program. There's even spatter at some of these. So if you want to look for the source of these Yakima basalts, the best way to do it is to go look for feeder dikes. but there are rare places where flows like the Rosa flow have true spatter that fell out of the sky 15, 16 million years ago. We'll look at some dates in just a second, and you can see that spatter right out there at Esquier Ranch. Okay, let's bump it up a notch. You ready? Let's get a little bit more advanced. Casbomb. So, stratigraphically, I have these old school publications I've used for years. Let's go to Docky. So you know where we are. We're up here now in the brown basalt time, sitting on top of the red, which sits on top of the green, which sits on top of the blue. Layer cake geology. Good. And we're talking about the Yakima Basalts with today's show and the next show before we finish out with the goat rocks. So, yeah, this one I'm using finally, Macken's. These are old school Macken stratigraphic section publications from 1961. Here is, I think, one of Macken's students, Hassan Deary, again, working with stratigraphy of the Yakima type section. So this is the kind of stuff that I cut my teeth on. This is the kind of stuff I cut my teeth on, these old dusty pamphlets and papers that have always been in this department. And when I started in the early 1990s, that was the first thing I started learning, the stratigraphy. And I would go out every day in the field, literally my first 3 weeks in town, every day with Bob Bentley and some students. And we'd be going in the Yakima River Canyon. He's like, all right, Nick, what flow is this up there? And I'm like, I don't have this figured out yet, Don. He's like, wrong. It's the McCoy Canyon. It's like, oh, my God. And it was a trial by fire, and I was treated just like an undergrad, even though I was this brand new master's level person replacing Jack Powell, and I was not Jack Powell, that's for sure. And so it was a trial by fire with Dr. Robert D. Bentley. I eventually proved my worth to him, but it took a few weeks of being grilled in front of God and everybody. And let me show you what I finally used so that I was ready for these pop quizzes where he's screaming at me in front of everybody else. Hang on. Here. So I finally said, Bob, I need something. I can't do this all verbally, and my notes are all screwed up. So he gave me this, or maybe I found it in the garbage can or something, and I finally colored it. And this is Bentley's handwriting. And we're going to look at the detail of some of these Yakima basalts as we ask the question, did some of these flows really cross the Cascades? I'm yelling because Bentley yelled a lot. Sometimes truly angry, sometimes kind of performative, and he thought it was funny and sarcastic, and it kind of was, but it was the early 90s. You can get away with that. You can't get away with that anymore, I don't think. Anyway, I was on the receiving end of a lot of that, and I survived. What can I say? So the point is, I'm learning the Macken stuff, and here's where we get into some details that are important for our discussion. Let's get to some of this straight. There's 300 of these layers in the German chocolate cake. There's 300 Yakima basalt layers, all of them coming out for those little black cracks in southeastern Washington, northeastern Oregon. But here's some things that Bentley taught me. If you get to the top of the Grand Ronde lava flows, first of all, the Grand Ronde lava flows are thick, they're voluminous, they covered the most real estate. This system was really cooking with the Grand Ronde lava flows. And in central Washington, the top of the Grand Ronde is easy to find. The top of the Grand Ronde lavas are easy to find because all through eastern Washington, there's a bench. There's a topographic bench. It's difficult to erode the Grand Ronde lavas because they're thick, and they typically don't have a lot of columns in them. And the younger Wanapum flows are thinner flows that didn't cover as much ground, and they're usually much more fractured. Those are the frickin' columns I lost my hammer into. And so this bench, this margin between the resistant Grand Ronde lavas and the wimpier Wanapum lava flows, wimpier with respect to how easy it was to erode them away, this becomes important. The top of the Grand Ronde, the youngest of the Grand Ronde flows. Obviously, I'm setting you up for something here. We're going to do some crossing of the Cascades potentially, and it's those Grand Ronde lavas that we're wondering about. It's not really the younger flows we're wondering about. It's the most voluminous Grand Ronde flows. You with me? And please note that there's a very noticeable sedimentary horizon at the top of the Grand Ronde and the base of the Wanapum. It's known as the Vantage sediment, named after a little town called Vantage, Washington. Okay, let's do a couple other cracks at it. Now I'm teaching. I still have Bentley ringing in my ears, but I'm making my own cartoons from my own field trips. And I'm, again, showing that bench at the top of the Grand Ronde. You know, this bench is the base of Grand Coulee. This bench is where I-90 climbs from Vantage Bridge up to Moses Coulee. Once you start looking for it, you can see this resistant top of this very resistant Grand Ronde lavas. And the Wanapum and the Saddle Mountain. Good. So J. Hoover Mackin is the guy that did much of the landmark stratigraphy of the Columbia River basalts. And he's the guy that I read to you at the beginning, saying that we had this total coverage of the Cascades when they were low hills by Grand Ronde lavas. Aaron Waters, who was featured last winter because he wrote the heartfelt letter applauding Brett's with all those years of talking about the Spokane flood and not being accepted. Waters was the guy who was at Johns Hopkins, and he mentored Richard Fisk and Tom Wright and Don Swanson and others. So Waters was also doing a bunch of geology on the Yakima Basalt. So many of the old school publications waiting for you are from Mackin and from Waters. Weird intersections with last winter's series. But I'm building towards something because the dates for the Grand Ronde, again, the Vantage is right at the top of the Grand Ronde. Then we're into the thinner, more cracked up flows of the Wanapum and the Saddle Mountains. The dates have always been tricky. And one way to keep track of where you are with all these dozens of lava flows within the thick Grand Ronde time was to truly look at the paleomagnetic signature, because basalts are heavy in iron, and you can keep track of these individual Grand Ronde lava flows not really by their hand sample. They all just look like a bunch of basalts. They're black and boring and whatever Rydell said. So paleomagnetically, that's one way to tell the difference between where you are in the German chocolate cake, because the iron particles with some of the basaltic eruptions have a magnetic reversal, and then another new batch of magmas during Grand Ronde time have a normal polarity. You'll have to do some reading on magnetic flips. But interestingly, one way, even today, to tell the difference between flows in the Grand Ronde is to say, are these reverse polarity magma basalts of the Grand Ronde, normal polarity magma, reversed, normal? So there were major flips of the Earth's magnetic field during this Grand Ronde time. But my point I'm leading to is that these are outdated. These are dates that are outdated. These are junky dates now. Because of Princeton University. There's a professor in New Jersey at Princeton University by the name of Blair Schoen, or Schoen. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I've never spoken directly with Blair. But like Blair Schoen has got this lab at Princeton, and he's doing this work with his grad students out here in the CRBs, the Columbia River basalts. And one of his grad students is Jennifer Kasbaum. And when she was a grad student studying under Blair Schoen from Princeton University, they started sampling silicic material in the interbeds between the basalt flows. So we know how impressed we are with Michael Eddy and Aaron Donaghy and their high-precision dates, right? Well, those skills were learned by Mike Eddy at Princeton University. And I'm like, was Mike Eddy a former student of this guy Blair? Is it really that small a world? And the answer is yes. November of 2023, I emailed Mike and said, do you know Blair? You must know this guy. And Mike's like, yep, good to hear from you. Blair Schoen was my undergraduate advisor at Princeton from 2009 to 2011. And then my postdoc advisor from 2016 to 2019, before Mike started at Purdue. So my connections with Princeton are pretty extensive. My connections with Princeton are pretty extensive. Track and field roster. Mike Eddy on the track team. This is this morning. I started Googling Mike and track and field. Bob Miller would call him Michael Eddy, All-American. I'm like, well, that's cute. That's cute. Here's this kid, Mike Eddy, who goes to Princeton, and they must have a cute little Ivy League track team, and that's adorable. And then you start looking at Mike Eddy's times as a sprinter at Princeton. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Do you know track and field? Do you know how fast these times are? This guy is literally an All-American. NCAA championships, Ivy League championships, the 4x400, the 500, which I didn't even know existed, North Carolina State champion in high school, captain of the team, Babb Trophy. Mike Eddy was a badass. And Mike Eddy could have gone to the Olympic trials, but chose to go out into the field in the North Cascades of Washington instead. I don't care if you're embarrassed by this or not, Mike. If I was an All-American track and field athlete in college, I'd be happy if somebody shared that. Wow. Badass Mike Eddy. So here's Mike. Yeah, my connections with Princeton are pretty extensive. Blair's a great guy, and he's from Seattle. I think he's trying to do a bit more Washington geology these days. He and Basil Tikoff, heard of him. We're doing something with the Duncan Hill Pluton. Heard of it. Last I heard, he's obviously going after the CRBs now. We're very friendly, and I hope we can collaborate some more in the future. Jen Kasbaum was a graduate student at Princeton when I was a postdoc. She's very focused on large igneous provinces and generally interested in Miocene timescales. The uranium, lead, zircon, TIMS community is shockingly small in the U.S. We all know each other very well and can trace our academic lineages back to just a few original labs. Nick, I'm finally starting to write the Washington proposal that I mentioned to you this summer. I think it will be focused on a paired intrusive-extrusive record for the Miocene just to the north of Mount St. Helens. So that was the fall of 2023, and he submitted his Spirit Lake Pluton project with Isla, Pamukchu, and they got accepted, and that's why we're doing the Cascade series. So it is a small world, and you're part of this world now, and you see all the connection between these people. It's pretty fun. So back to the story, the vantage time, the Grand Ronde time. So what new dates does Jennifer Kasbaum and her former advisor Blair Schoen have for us? Is it what I always taught? The Grand Rondes came out of the ground between 16 million years ago and 15.6 million years ago. Write it down, students. No. And these dates came out in 2018. And I've noticed that USGS people still use the old dates. I don't know why. They're certainly aware of this new work. This is incredibly precise work from the Princeton lab. The lab that trained Mike Eddy to get these precise dates. Why aren't we using these new dates? Let's go. So the Grand Ronde lavas, the lavas that are presumed to be the flows that cross the Cascades. The old dates were 16 to 15.6 million years ago. Jennifer Kasbaum, Blair Schoen, and others from Princeton now have highly precise dates, and we have most of the lavas coming out in a much shorter period of time. This is a 1 million year time span between the Steens lavas down in Oregon and up to Wanapum time. So I am now using, in my teaching, 16.5 to 16.1 for the Grand Ronde. So we're back to my colorful brown and yellow sketches. We now know the significance of the top of the Grand Ronde. We now know what they mean by R2 and N2. Get rid of this frickin' dock, please. Hey, get rid of the dock. Thank you. And here are some of the new dates. I'm trying to just update every geologist who's watching these things. Please use the new dates. Or do you have a problem with the new dates? What's your problem? What's your problem? What's your deal? I also took these old maps from Terry Tolan and others who did amazing work and made new maps. And I now have the new dates that I'd like to put on the maps. We're heading towards the crossing question, taking our own sweet time. I like this one just because it shows selected communities in Washington that are built on top of the German chocolate cake and other cities that are not. But if we go back before Jennifer's 16.5 million year old date, the Amnaha eruptions are mostly down in Oregon. There is no major story of German chocolate cake at Ellensburg or Vantage or Chelan or Moses Coulee or Spokane. But it's the Grand Ronde time, everybody. Between 16.5 and 16.1, that's the time that we have these biblical amounts of lava flooding the Pacific Northwest. But you know what we're asking today, was this really not covered in orange? Or was it covered in orange? And has since been uplifted so that the lavas have been eroded away for good. And once we get to ginkgo time, ginkgo time is younger than the Vantage. Ginkgo time is the first Wanapum flow that erupted after that long hiatus when this Vantage sediment was being Are you with me now? Once we get to ginkgo flow time, the huge volumes are done. But I'm including ginkgo today because here's the fissure in eastern Washington. Here's where the ginkgo flow covered, not nearly the volume of the Grand Ronde, but look what we have. We have a Yakima basalt erupting in eastern Washington and crossing the Cascades in Oregon, not confined to the Columbia River Gorge itself. And the Rosa flow and the Priest Rapids flow, giving you the new dates. Umatilla, Jennifer didn't bother with these younger flows, so I don't have precise dates for you. Jennifer Kasbaum, Princeton University. These are interesting Yakima basalts, but they don't really fit in nicely to our show today. I'm just including them for us to talk about and think about. But it's the Grand Ronde time where we are spending most of our attention today. Yes, I think most of you know, Kevin Pogue is reminding us that those originally flat basaltic lava flows were compressed and folded so that we had the Yakima Fold Belt. I don't think we're spending that much time thinking about the Yakima Fold Belt today, but here's Ellensburg, here's Yakima, here's Goat Rocks, here's Mount Adams. Sorry, where's Goat Rock? Goat Rocks is here. Hammond Land is here. Seattle's here. Yeah, this is more next time, I think, where we really think about the folding and the wrinkling of the areas outside of the Cascade Arc. But we're not talking about that today. Come on. What are you doing? We're not talking about this. Skip it. Save it for Saturday. Save it for Saturday. Save it. But I want to talk about a Yakima basalt that has crossed the Cascades. In Oregon, mind you. But everyone agrees that this is a story. That the Ginkgo flow, slightly younger than the Grand Ronde flows, is flowing under what is now Mount Hood and getting to the ocean. In the specific pathway of the Ginkgo lava flow, again, Mount Hood is sitting right on top of this former pathway of one of the Yakima basalts known as the Ginkgo lava flow, and it's going cross-country when the Cascades were low. That's the point. Crossing the Cascades when the Cascades are low and when the Coast Range is low. And that vantage sediment is sitting directly underneath this Ginkgo lava flow. I can feel I'm losing some of you. I don't know why. You're not here in the room. I can't see you, but weirdly, I think I can feel you. We're heading towards some detail with the crux, and we're getting there. But now we're past the basics. We're past Mike Eddy and Jennifer Kasbaum in Princeton and the brand new dates we have for some of these eruptions. And now we're playing with the idea that, is this a crazy question? I guess it's less crazy than I thought initially. That's you talking. Because we do have the Ginkgo flow crossing what is now significant topography. And this vantage horizon is beautifully on display near Bickleton, Washington. These are my photos, everybody. Nick in Ellensburg. And those Ginkgo bases are full of logs. So yes, the petrified wood is part of the Ginkgo story. But why did I keep showing this crappy old grainy photo? Because I found it. With the help of Bruce Bjornstedt, I found that dike. Because I was going to make a video program with Oregon Public Broadcasting. They got interested in this story idea of an eruption of a Yakima basalt in eastern Washington and following that Ginkgo flow all the way to the Oregon coast. The producers of Oregon Public Broadcasting said, sold, let's do it. And so a couple years ago, I made an episode. And we featured this dike. You want to go there? I'll show you the first few minutes of this episode.
I keep hearing about Yakima Head, and this is it. Lighthouse and everything else. And there's a fascinating lava story. I'm not sure I believe it, but I think that there's some detail in this lava that will tell us something surprising.
Spend just a few minutes with geologist Nick Zentner, and it's clear this man loves rocks.
Unbelievable. This is so frickin' cool. I can't believe it.
What Nick's so excited about is this rock. It's called the Ginkgo flow, after some ginkgo trees that wound up petrified in the molten lava.
So, you see some gold things. What do they look like?
It looks like little coppery gems or something.
Coppery gems. I like it. I was hoping that this ginkgo flow would look exactly like this with these crystals, but I never dreamed it would be this obvious and this beautiful. I mean, I'm serious. Like, this is one of the highlight moments for me in the last 35 years.
That's high praise from someone who teaches geology at Central Washington University, hosts a TV series called Nick on the Rocks,
And it's more than complicated, it's controversial.
and whose online lecture series gets hundreds of thousands of views.
I have seen this lava with these crystals in eastern Washington, and I can show you a spot along the Snake River where there's proof that that's where the eruption was of this lava. 300 miles inland, almost to Idaho. Are you interested in going?
Yeah, let's do it.
Traveling across northern Oregon to eastern Washington takes you through the geologic wonder known as the Columbia River Basalt Group, a series of lava flows that blanketed the Northwest some 16 million years ago. It makes up what Nick likes to call the German chocolate cake.
If you think of a German chocolate cake, there's 300 layers in the cake, and the ginkgo flow is just one of the 300.
Here in eastern Washington, the Snake River cuts right through that cake. Pretty soon, we're headed off-road to a place Nick's heard about, but never actually seen.
I'm hoping when we round this corner, we'll see this obvious kind of fin-like wall. Let's get the drum roll out. I think that's it. I think that's it.
Wow.
Like, how would you describe that shape of those things?
It looks like a Christmas tree to me, with just the center going up and the branches kind of...
It kind of does, doesn't it? So we're looking inside of this German chocolate cake. All the layers are horizontal. And then here's this thing cutting up through that's called a feeder dike. And this is the ginkgo flow. This is the same one we saw at the Oregon coast. This is ground zero for that flow. And to make sure this is the ginkgo, and I don't even need a hand lens.
There's our orangey crystals.
There's orange crystals.
So that's our telltale puzzle piece.
Yeah. I mean, God, that is, I've seen photos of this for like 30 years. It is kind of a thrill to be here, I gotta say. So if we're here 16.1 million years ago, Jewel, this is the crack that opens up Superman style. Here comes this ginkgo magma with the orange crystals inside, but it gets more interesting than that. It's not just one point of fire fountaining, but this crack is tens of miles long across eastern Washington, so to have this curtain of fire. You've got this hot syrup that's now starting to flow. Why is it just basically heading west? What do you think?
All right, stop.
Slope?
Yeah.
How do we get out of this?
I think we can just say, most of this isn't rocket science.
It's rock.
All right, thanks. That was for Oregon Public Broadcasting. That was Jewel, who was the producer, and Brandon was the videographer. I can say this, full disclosure. We had not restarted the Nick on the Rock series out of Seattle. This is 3 years ago, I guess. I don't know. And I thought maybe I was going to take Nick on the Rocks down to Oregon Public Broadcasting and work with that kid, Brandon. So that was kind of a trial show to see if that worked. And in the meantime, I found Brady Lawrence, and the Seattle folks were real interested in starting the Nick on the Rocks thing again. So that was a one-time only thing, working with Oregon Public Broadcasting. It was fun, but it wasn't Brady and Gary. Good. I'm starting to think, keep going. I'll save that. So thank you. That was fun to actually show a video off of YouTube directly. So that was the ginkgo flow. Now we focus in on the question of today, crossing the Cascades. So there's two things that I have in mind. My initial thought 10 days ago was that we had a blanket of orange crossing everything. And that's certainly what Mackin was talking about in 1947, right? And that seems to be the whole hog. Like that's buying the idea 100%. That we just fill everything in that's orange. And you're like, am I missing something? Why is this even a question? Because these Cascades are tall. This is you talking right now. This is record scratch time. Like I don't understand why this is even a discussion. Cascades are a big mountain range. Those lava flows were big, but they weren't that big. Why are we even asking this question? And again, I remind you that the Cascades were low. They were certainly lower than today. They were probably significantly lower than today. And so when we look at a map like this, if these hills are truly hills and not a massive Cascade range during this time frame, and these lavas along this margin are 2,000 feet thick today, why wouldn't you agree with Mackin, J. Hoover Mackin, and just bring these orange guys all the way over to I-5? Why wouldn't this whole scene be orange, and it's not orange today because of younger tectonic uplift? I'll give it away. Everyone in geology who's thought about the uplift of the Cascades, I guess this is Saturday, everybody that's thought about the uplift of the Cascades all agree it's got to be a younger uplift than 10 million years ago. In other ways, another way of saying it is that everyone in geology who study the Cascades agree that at 10 million years ago, the Cascades were lower, significantly lower than they are today. And so suddenly this question is not crazy. And so I think we have two choices. One is to wonder if we have a thick orange blanket that got eroded by the young uplift, or, I didn't know I could do that, or, can I go backwards, please? If we don't have an orange blanket, do we have an orange channel? Similar to the orange channel that got our ginkgo flow, which was younger, to the lighthouses at the Oregon coast. So so I'm talking to you now, geologist. If it sounds too risky to put your reputation on the line and say there was a Yakima orange blanket covering the entire Cascades of Washington 16 million years ago, okay, then let's dial it down. And can we entertain channels of orange flood basalts, Grand Ronde in age, somehow getting through the Cascades, again, when the Cascades were lower? That's what we're doing the rest of today and into Saturday. Is there a channel or is there an orange blanket? And again, if we have this much thickness of intact German chocolate cake snuggled right up against what is today the Cascades, then how do we explain that? These lavas are not just putting on the brakes right here, and they're not pinching down to nothing. So another way of saying it is when we look at that Gary Paul photo, I think everybody in geology agrees that there was some flood basalt that got chewed away. It's just a question of, was there 1 more mile west of the Yakima basalts, 5 miles further west, 15 miles further west, or if you want to be extreme about it, 100 miles further west and lapping up against the tidewater of the Pacific Ocean back that time. We already know this. There's Mackin himself, very fond of him through his writing. Never met him, of course. We read this at the beginning. There it is again. But I do want to read from Bates McKee. And I don't know all of Bates's story, but Bates McKee was also at the University of Washington. And in this book, Cascadia, which was a well-done textbook in the early 1970s, Bates McKee dedicated this textbook to the late J. Hoover Mackin, colleague and friend. And again, the date of this publication is 1972. So I did a little bit of this with Sky Cooley in the video library, but let's just do a little bit extra and read from Bates McKee, still entertaining this idea of a blanket of orange coming over. Earlier in the chapter of this textbook, students, we noted that a period of folding, faulting, and widespread erosion occurred late in the Eocene between the time of deposition of the two major Cascade stratigraphic sequences. He's talking about green time and red time. Following this, the region remained relatively stable for perhaps 20 million years. And this is suggested by the absence of major unconformities in the Oligocene and early Miocene stratigraphic record. I know full well I'm going to lose a few of you now, but I want to drill down to some detail, and I use numbers and colors. I don't use these words Oligocene. I still don't even use those or even know what they mean. I know I can look them up, but they're useless to me, those words. I want numbers and colors, baby. Okay? Then, in about the middle of the Miocene, there began one of the major orogenies of the Cordillera, an orogeny that in some ways is continuing today. It began before the great eruptions of the CRBs. And in a few million years' time, it had produced great folds in the strata, thousands of feet high, and fault displacements of comparable magnitude. The actual effect of this deformation on the topography of the region was less pronounced, for erosion partly offset the uplift. Okay, what's this guy talking about? Bates McKee is saying that there's significant folding and faulting late in the red time before the brown lavas. And yet, he's saying we don't have massive cascades because there's just as much erosion going on as folding and faulting. So he's commenting that it's not flat like Ohanapakash time, late in red. Like if I want pink, I guess that would be the pink time. But the point is he's setting the stage for these monster Grand Ronde lava flows, brown. Perhaps no major ranges were produced. At least much of the Cascade region has been worn down to rolling hills by the time of the first outpourings of the brown Grand Ronde basalt. I want to continue. The emplacement of granitic batholiths and stocks roughly coincided with the folding and faulting. He's still in red time now. The largest of these plutons, principally the Snoqualmie batholith, the Tatoosh, and the Bumping Lake. The smaller stocks, 14 to 18 million years old. Shallow intrusions crystallized near the surface. The andesite lava in the Palisades, and then we get into the stuff I read with Sky. So I'm including this because I don't know if I'm going to try to deal with it on Saturday or not, but it does feel like I'm maybe missing a couple of interesting things younger than the crux of Hammondland, but before unleashing the hounds and having these brown Grand Ronde lavas heading for the Cascades. That's reminding me, I might want to dig into that a little deeper, but let's continue. Who better to go to than Don Swanson himself? You remember Don Swanson? You remember Don Swanson who did this, right? Don Swanson's Tieton Volcano, where U.S. Highway 12 between Yakima and Rimrock Lake, you're driving right through that ghost volcano at Trout Lodge. And we were focused on red and the radial dike pattern in the last episode. Well, what does he have here? Making up the flats of Bethel Ridge. Making up the flats where I parked my white car at Cache Prairie before I hiked out with that beautiful video last time. And down here at Divide Ridge and Jump Off Joe and Jump Off Road and Jump Off Point and all these jump off places. Everybody's suicidal back in the day. It's Yakima Basalt flowing around this ghost volcano. Don Swanson, one of the biggest names in geology, period, let alone the Pacific Northwest geology. What does he think about this old idea, did the flood basalts cross the Cascades? What do you think of the idea that the Columbia River basalts extended over the crest of the Cascades, and there's been uplift of the Cascades since then? That I've heard Eric Cheney talk about that over the years. I don't know if anybody else likes it, but I mean, we get to Divide Ridge south of Rimrock Lake, and then we kind of lose those CRBs. Who better to ask than you? Is there any reason to think that's a possibility?
I was sure looking for that when I was working south or west, southwest of Gold Rocks. I never found a single remnant. That doesn't mean to say that they weren't there one time and had been eroded off.
Yeah.
But I never, you build a case with no evidence for it.
Right.
On Divide Ridge, the basalts were, many of them were flowing into water. There were rivers present, and but whether the rivers were, it was hard to tell for sure. But I thought the rivers were flowing eastward from the Cascades, so that the higher part of the Cascades was still farther west than that. But I can never be sure of that. And
Yeah.
so I was very open to the possibility, and was looking very carefully for Grand Ronde west of the crest, but I never found any.
Okay. So one of the many papers waiting for you is this beautiful paper by Don Swanson in 1967. We're going to look at it carefully, and then I see that it's about 1:23 p.m. So maybe when we're done with the Don Swanson segment, we'll wrap it up for today. We'll go to your live Q&A, and then we'll just continue this discussion with Sky Cooley, with Lydia Steisch, with Andrew Sadowski, with Eric Cheney, and continuing to think about this question. Because I wasn't lying. I got a lot of stuff here. So let's just look at a few segments of this Don Swanson paper, and then you've got the full paper to enjoy on your own time. Yakima Basalt of the Tieton River area. So Don has finished his PhD. He's now working for the USGS based out of Menlo Park, California. He's probably in his late 20s at this point. This guy is just tearing everything up, and he never let up his whole career. He's still with us. What an inspiration Don Swanson has been for me and so many others. But here he is as a young guy, and he's going great guns with not just the Tieton volcano, but a lot of this other stuff. Up to 1,700 vertical feet of Grand Ronde Yakima basalt of the Columbia River group underlie much of the eastern flank of the Cascade Range in the Tieton River area near Yakima. Local relief was more than 1,700 feet, so thicknesses of each of the 15 exposed flows of Grand Ronde vary widely. Single flows can be traced for many miles and terminate only against local topographic highs. Randomly skipping around. I did my mapping, says Don Swanson, during the 1962 and 1963 fieldwork for my PhD dissertation. I did stratigraphic sections of the Yakima basalt at Windy Point, Jump Off, the middle of Divide Ridge, Bethel Ridge, and Darling Mountain. And specimens were brought back to Baltimore to do detailed work. Here's his strat columns in this beautiful paper, correlating between some of the individual Grand Ronde lava flows. Beautiful maps, very elegant, simple maps. This is the margin. This is the edge today, the western edge today of the brown German chocolate cake. Here's Pasco, here's Priest Rapids, here's Vantage, here's Ellensburg, here's Yakima. This is essentially Hammond Land right here. White Pass, Mount Rainier. We're wondering, was this line originally over here someplace before the Cascade uplift? Or was this western edge line way the hell over in Puget Lowland? The Yakima basalt, pre-tertiary to middle Miocene, several episodes of deposition, volcanism, deformation, and erosion. The red Fife's Peak the Fife's Peak is the youngest of the pre-Yakima rocks, right, it's red, and its relationship to the overlying Yakima basalt should be made clear. The Fife's Peak has andesitic tuffs, breccias, flows, rhyolitic pumice flows erupted from at least 2 lofty stratovolcanoes, Paul Hammond says 38, and the youngest of which, Tieton Volcano, approximated present-day Mount Adams in size. We're good. We know that from last episode. The contact with the red and the overlying brown is unconformable, meaning there was a bunch of time that went by between the end of red and the beginning of brown. Faulting and associated contemporaneous intrusive activity disturbed the Fight Peaks rocks area in the western part of the area, and erosion had largely smoothed the Fife's Peak topography, though Tieton Volcano still stood at least 1,600 feet above its base. What I'm getting at is that we are not the first to wonder about this question. We're also not the first to wonder how low is low in the South Cascades of Washington elevation-wise. And you're like, who cares? We care because I think we can all agree, can't we? It's a cool question. If this thing is low, if these Cascades are just a bunch of hills with occasional Mount Rainier-like cones standing there 16 million years ago, you with me? We're not talking about the ginkgo now. We're talking about the Grand Ronde. We're talking about the big boys, the big fat monster lava flows, right? That came out of the cracks. If we just have a bunch of little hills and we have a couple of Mount Rainier-like cones, you want me to make them bigger? I will. Don't we have a lot of space in between the cones that these Yakima basalts can flow through? And Don Swanson himself, in the last episode, in the Hammondland episode, was wondering if we totally buried. He's like, these Yakima basalts are almost 2,000 feet thick. 2,000, not 10,000. We're playing with elevations, we're playing with thicknesses, and we're playing with time, realizing that the South Cascades of Washington 16 million years ago are not anywhere close to the way they look today. I think you have it. We're wrapping it up. I'm deciding, we're wrapping it up. Yeah, the paper waits for you. But I think this is where I want to finish. You remember Tom from Maple Valley and his gorgeous map of the Tatoosh Pluton, which is red. If you dig into Don Swanson's paper and a few other resources waiting for you, we're going to have a rainbow Tatoosh. And that's not coming from Emily Mullen doing some high fancy stuff. That's coming from field relationships that Don Swanson and others have noticed. That during brown time, during the time we're invading this area with Yakima basalt, apparently there is some more silicic plutonic activity going on. Too old for the goat rocks. But Rainbow Tatoosh needs to be added to our list, I think. That's where we'll finish. Don Swanson saying, we have a margin. I've looked carefully at different places and I've measured the thickness of these Grand Ronde lava flows very, very carefully. And I am sure that these Yakima basalts made it further west than they currently do for all sorts of reasons. And on Saturday, dear viewer, if you tune in at 8 a.m. Pacific time, we will continue wondering, how far west did those flood basalts reach? Time for some live Q&A at 1:30 p.m. on Thursday, February 13th of 2025. And we have a frozen camera. Maybe you can see the snow. Nat, we have a frozen camera. Uppercase, please. Let's do a bunch of questions. Kevin, do we have any sense of the paleo elevation of central Washington relative to the early Cascades? Higher, lower, or equal? Would this info help or detract from the idea of crossing the Cascades? That's a great question. Thank you, Kevin. Haven't thought much about it. Certainly the weight of the German chocolate cake depressed the crust. So we keep lowering the elevation of eastern Washington during the flood basalt time. That's an interesting thought. Are we decreasing our chances of crossing some low Cascades with each eruption because each eruption is pushing the landscape lower? Like we keep dropping the floor in the desert of eastern Washington. And so we're trying to build this ramp to get these flows up and over the hills, but we keep lowering the elevations. I think that's what you're saying. Interesting thought, Kevin. Thank you. Steve, could remnants of the Grand Ronde be found and identified in sediments west of the Cascades? That's what I wondered too. And I've been asking, that will be one of the things we try to discuss on Saturday. I already have Zoom interviews in the video library if you want to peek ahead to what we'll do on Saturday. Garrett, from the Netherlands, is the Palisades viewpoint on US 12 also Columbia River basalt? It's not. Thanks. Good thought, Garrett. Do you remember visiting that spot? That's lava from the Goat Rocks volcano, which we'll talk about soon enough. I'm doing a Zoom interview with Kelly Wall tomorrow morning on Friday. John, is oceanic crust of the basement of the Columbia Basin below the CRB. It could explain why the crust was so thin and vulnerable to isostatic depression. Is oceanic crust the basement of the Columbia Basin? I don't know, John. Wouldn't you just extrapolate all the basement units that we have in the North Cascades and extrapolate those? And have the Chumstick Basin and a bunch of other things? I don't know why it needs to be oceanic crust underneath the German chocolate cake. Wes, any thoughts? Automatic scroll. Hang on, Wes. Hang on, I'm scrolling back. Any thoughts on whether the Cascades area of the past, before the main uplift, was similar to Iceland today, with some low volcanic mountains and lots of lava flows, including lowland areas? Thanks, Wes. Maybe I can add this to Wednesday's show, to Saturday morning show. I got distracted. The snow is so beautiful, but I got a frozen camera. Maybe I can add this to Saturday morning. I think the company line is, when the basalts are erupting in eastern Washington, the Cascades are shut off. I think that's a narrative. And maybe that's why I hinted at what Don Swanson was saying, that we have some tattoosh action. I think Don was saying, and maybe Fisk was saying this as well from the Mount Rainier paper, that there's magmas of the tattoosh pluton that are breaking the surface and actually being volcanic eruptions in Mount Rainier National Park 16 million years ago. That's why I thought we should have brown for part of the tattoosh. That's kind of what you're saying. But that feels like straying from the narrative, which I think is there, that during the eruptions in eastern Washington, the Cascades are weirdly quiet. And then I think, based on our question today, I think I remember asking out loud 25 years ago, Why you say the Cascades are quiet? Just because you don't have a bunch of lavas? And they go, yeah, there's not a bunch of lavas in the Cascades 16 million years ago. Like eruptions in the Cascades, like andesites and dacites and rhyolites and stuff. And I would come right back and say, well, how about they were all there and they just got eroded away? Lack of lavas doesn't necessarily mean the volcanoes quit. You really saying the subduction stopped? Maybe we'll go in that direction. Joel Gombiner, nice to see you here. What changed at 10 million years ago to cause the uplift of the Cascades? Good question. And Joel, if you stick with us on Saturday or go to the video library, you'll see that, sneak peek for Saturday, there's major disagreement between geologists about when we really start jacking up the Cascades uplift. Some say as young as 3 million years ago, you start major uplift. Some say 7 million years ago, you start major uplift. Like you're saying, Joel, some say 10, you start major uplift. We'll look at some of the evidence that people are referring to help with that number. A few more. Patrick, could Lake Chelan region be older than currently thought? Could it be a passageway for CRBs as the home of the Proto-Okanagan River? Stay tuned on Saturday, Patrick, where Jerome Lessman has been catching up, and he's got some thoughts related to yours. Good. Love is the answer. The Yellowstone hotspot seems much more vigorous than Hawaii and Yellowstone. Does the subduction zone compound the volumes of lavas with that extra shutoff as the continents drifted further west? Sorry, I'm not following you there. I view subduction and Yellowstone hotspot and these other things as separate discussions. I'm sorry, I just can't follow that. Charles, maybe the rate of isostatic depression of the Columbia Basin was slow enough that the rate of effusion pushed the Columbia rivers over the crest, and that overflow has since been removed by Ice Age erosion. Thank you, Charles. Yeah, if we didn't have such thick CRBs in the foothills of the Cascades, I don't think I would be interested in the question. To me, that's the big part of this. That let's finish that way. I did this with the sky video. Let's try it here. So this is today's Cascades. And this is east, and this is west. And it's, can I find Gary's photo quick? Hang on. Can I find Gary's photo? Oh, shit. It's perfect. Yeah, let's do this. So this is my photo up on Table Mountain. And I'm showing this a little bit more exaggerated than it needs to be. And here's Gary Paul's photo. Again, we're taking a part of the German chocolate cake and we're just cutting it. We're to the edge of the cake, but we're just cutting it off. And that cutting, why is it cut so, why is this cut so clearly? Why do we have 2,000 feet of German chocolate cake? That's not a minor amount. That's just cut. And at least north of Ellensburg, there's a bunch of landslides. This margin of the CRBs as it is interfacing with the crystalline core is usually a very unstable place. And so there's all sorts of instability. And interestingly, these Grand Ronde lavas are basaltic andesites. unlike everything older and everything younger in the cake. These monster Grand Ronde lavas are also chemically slightly different. They have a little bit more silica than everything else above and below in the cake. So this is the question for me. Why is it cut so cleanly? And then a more radical thought is that, do we really have a matching cut in the cake on the other side? And did we once upon a time have the German chocolate cake continuous across the way? Steamboat Mountain is a small part of that answer. A toast to you. Here's to you for joining us for today's episode. Thank you. Here's to your health in mid-February. And most of us in the Northern Hemisphere, it's a tough time health-wise. Speaking for myself, a few pounds heavier and still hibernating mostly and working on these letters, which is a great thrill and enjoying doing. I enjoy doing it, but it's time to be more active and to be out in fresh sunshine and fresh air with warmer temperatures. It's coming sooner than we think. At least that's what I keep telling myself. So here's to warmer days ahead. Awkward toast. I am so determined to show you the snow. It's not that great, but it's snowing, that I want to show you that before we quit. I'm going to literally move the camera to the window, the one camera that's not frozen, and do that. So, thank you, everybody. I love you. Here's lots of love coming your way from Ellensburg, Washington, USA. You've got to be kidding me. Well, now I have to do it again. There we go. Thank you. I love you, and we'll see you less than 48 hours from now, 8 o'clock a.m. Pacific time for episode W. Maybe I'll call it Crossing the Cascades. Thank you. Goodbye. Come on, you frickin' thing. Whatever.